doing out there? If you're a first-time visitor to Zilog and Moto, my name is Dave, and this is the channel where I'm on a singular mission to go out and collect each and every English language game released for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X. And then not just warehouse them on some dusty bookshelves. Oh no, I'm going to play and review each and every one of these games, good and bad, and then report my findings back to you. You may ask the question, why? And then of course my first instinct is to go totally kindergarten style on you and respond with, because. And then maybe stick my tongue out or something. I'll spare you the raspberries on that one, but in all seriousness, I really enjoy this era of gaming and these consoles, and I didn't see anyone else out there doing this. Sure, there's 100 reviews out there for something great like Streets of Rage 2, or something terrible like Action 52, but who's out there reviewing Barney's hide-and-seek game, or Art Alive? Well, this guy, that's who. So, if that sort of in-depth look at these Sega libraries is interesting to you, I recommend you subscribe to the channel so that you know when new videos get posted, usually once a week, unless life gets in the way, and it helps other people see the channel as well. Also, to all 282 of you out there that have already subscribed, I just want to say thank you. I was looking at the stats last night, and in the 3 years that the channel has existed, and yes, that anniversary just hit last week, 10% of all the views and time spent watching was in the last month alone. So, things are definitely coming up Millhouse around here. Okay, enough shameless self-promotion. Who wants to see that anyway? It's about as popular as the section in the video where the YouTuber tries to sneak in an ad for NordVPN or some terrible fake cereal. Alright, let's get to this week's game, which sees me going back to the Sega CD for the first time since I looked at the disappointing Space Ace about 10 episodes ago. And that game is Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, the Second Cataclysm. If you look at this cover or hear that name and go, okay, WTF, well, that would be understandable. Don't worry, I'll explain in due time, or at least as much as I can. But first, a bit of a backstory. When I was younger, I didn't have a Sega CD. I had some friends that did, and I thoroughly enjoyed playing the Sega CD when I was at their house, especially when they rented a little game called Final Fight, which might still be my favorite arcade game of all time, even 30 years later. It's at least in the top 5. At the time, the Sega CD version of Final Fight was the closest you could get to playing the arcade game at home, and I was all about it. Well, about the same time, Capcom released a new game to the arcades on that same CPS1 platform called Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, and it was awesome. It was Final Fight, but with different characters, weapons, and freaking dinosaurs. So, imagine my excitement when learning that Cadillacs and Dinosaurs was coming to the Sega CD, just like Final Fight had right before it. Unfortunately, as you might be able to tell from looking at that package, the game that came to the Sega CD was not, in fact, that Capcom Arcade game, but instead somewhat of a sequel or side game. And I say somewhat because Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, the Second Cataclysm, is not a side-scrolling beat-em-up. Well, what is it? And more importantly, is it any good? Well, I'll take a look at all that and more, but first, our look at the package. And this is my copy of Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, the Second Cataclysm, complete with an unfortunate big old crack in the front of the cover, but thankfully the rest of the package is in pretty good shape. When I picked this up for reviewing this week, I had thought about maybe finally buying a few of those reproduction Sega CD cases that are supposed to be very similar to the original ones, and I decided against it without actually being able to see them in person. Maybe if I run into some at an upcoming convention or something like that. The cover art is pretty great and fits well into the space available. There's the Rocket Science Games name at the top, not Capcom, more on that in a bit, and then the traditional, very cool looking Cadillacs and Dinosaurs logo with the Second Cataclysm tagline tucked in right below. As much as I like the art design for the logo, I do think that it's a little sneaky that the Second Cataclysm is so small. Granted, I know that they had to conserve space due to the layout restrictions, but I've got to think that there were a ton of kids out there that got this game thinking it was the arcade game due to not noticing that, and then, of course, it's not. The rest of the art appears to come straight from one of the issues of the comic book series, and it just looks cool, with the titular caddy and some dinosaurs featured prominently on the cover, while heroes Jack and Hannah fight for their lives. I don't know if this is actually a scene from one of the comic books or if it was created specifically for this game, but from what I can tell, it's definitely not the cover art from any of them. Flipping over to the back, and I like this rear cover. They went with a yellow background that matches nicely with the gold in the logo, and all of the art and screenshots pop when put up against it. The screenshots are all of good quality, although there's the usual Sega CD shenanigans of including a quote-unquote screenshot that's clearly a cleaned-up version of the in-game artwork, rather than reflecting what the game actually looks like on screen. I wouldn't mind it so much, and I know they have to sell the game, but it just stands out like a sore thumb when compared to the other 3 action shots. The flavor text is solid, and refreshing after the mess that was great volleyball last week. I love the tagline at the top, in red, in case you didn't realize it was important. Welcome to a world gone mad. Now that's how you set the mood for a video game. And the rest of the text sets the backstory up perfectly while also describing the game itself. Opening up the box, and this is a fully complete copy, not only featuring a product guide from Rocket Science Games, but also the original foam disc protector. The product guide is a pretty bizarre thing to look at, especially almost 30 years later, considering the developer has been out of business for about 25 years, and left more canceled games than finished ones. I really wonder how many of these crazy items were actually produced, much less sold. Oh, and those of you that complain about spending $70 on games for modern consoles, take a look at this order page. Yeah, that's about $136 in 2022. The manual looks fantastic, but it's not without issue. It starts out with 5 pages of comic-styled art setting up the story, then a glossary and a character breakdown if you're not familiar with the comic book the game is based on. And then there's a quick explanation of how to play the game that technically covers everything, but really could have used a bit more detail. Okay, well it appears Rocket Science Games got the package right, but what about the game inside? Well, let's take a look. As I alluded to at the end of the intro, Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, the Second Cataclysm, is not a port of the Capcom CPS1 Arcade game, as you can probably tell with it having a different name. It's also not a sequel to the arcade game, despite what the subtitle might hint at with the Second Cataclysm. Further separating the games, the Capcom Arcade game is actually derived from the short-lived Saturday morning cartoon series, which in turn was based on the Xenozoic Tales comic series, whereas the Second Cataclysm is inspired directly by the various stories and characters in the comic books. In theory, this is a good thing, and indeed, the comic book stylings of the game are its best feature. The comic pages that set up the game's backstory in the beginning of the manual are just the beginning. After booting up the game, you're treated to an intro video that's a combination of still art and animation with a narration from Hobbs of the Grith, aka a telepathic ally of your characters, that sets up the backstory of the forming of the Xenozoic Age before dumping you into the start menu. But the video sequences don't stop there. There's also a video that introduces each of the 9 levels in the game, complete with voice acting for each of the characters, and there's usually a few smaller video sequences tucked into each level, allowing them to create much needed breaks in the action and better frame the action sequences that you run into. Also, and something I unfortunately know all too well, the game has tons of different short death sequences for the characters, with each being customized to play depending on how you manage to die in the game, with some of these sequences actually being a bit disturbing for a video game from 1993, fairly earning the game's MA13 VRC rating. The Xenozoic Tales series of comic books won multiple awards during its short run, with one of those awards being an Eisner Award for Best Short Story in 1992, and the story echoes the slightly campy post-apocalyptic sci-fi serial world of those tales. If you told me that the game was based on a specific issue of the comic series, or that they adapted the plot of the game into a one-shot comic, I wouldn't be surprised. The game's story isn't incredibly deep, with it mainly serving to move the action along between the levels, but it is there, and it's not your run-of-the-mill superhero adventure. Unfortunately, when it comes to positive things about the game, those 2 previous paragraphs are about the extent of it. Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, the Second Cataclysm, is not good, and at times it's barely a game, much less a good game. In fact, there were many times when I was banging my head against a wall trying to finish even the first level, where I wondered if the staff at Rocket Science Games had ever played a video game before designing the Second Cataclysm, because to play it doesn't seem like it. Full disclosure, if you've seen my previous videos on the channel for Sewer Shark or Ground Zero Texas, you know I don't necessarily mind FMV games, especially when they're designed well, like Sewer Shark and the first half of Ground Zero Texas are. Grainy video on the Sega CD aside, if a game is genuinely fun, you can look past the console's limitations. Like Sewer Shark, the Second Cataclysm is a rail shooter laying on top of an FMV-based background, but instead of piloting a vehicle riding around in the sewers, you're instead either riding around the jungle in Jack's Cadillac, or later navigating underground tunnels in a motorized minecar. Let's start with those first 6 levels of the game, where Jack is driving around in the Caddy, while Hannah is riding shotgun, quite literally, by being responsible for shooting obstacles and enemies in your path. The game allows for you to play in either single-player mode, where you're driving and shooting at the same time, or in 2-player mode, where player 1 is in control of Jack and thus the steering, and player 2 is in control of Hannah to handle all of your shooting needs. This is actually a decent, albeit simple design, although single-player mode would certainly be better if it was running on a modern console that supported a dual thumbstick controller, allowing for steering and shooting to be controlled independently. So where does everything go wrong? Well, I'm glad you asked. For these first 6 levels, you end up steering the Cadillac down a series of jungle paths that all look more or less the same, with one goal, and that's surviving until you get to the end of a level while taking a minimum amount of time off the clock, as the entire game is on a 60-minute time limit. Yes, that's right, you have only an hour to prevent the Second Cataclysm from occurring. Okay, so it's a action racer then. Maybe similar to the arcade game Lucky and Wild? Well, that doesn't sound so bad. Well, not so fast. While you're trying to get from the beginning of each level to the end as quickly as possible, it's not as simple as just driving from point A to point B, like it is in most other racing games. No, instead, each level is made up of multiple branching paths, and the problem is, there's only one way to get through the level successfully, and oh by the way, there's no indication of how to make it through the jungle. Essentially, each of the levels is a maze, and the only way you can make it to the end of the level is purely by trial and error, which, let me tell you, is an awesome game mechanic when you're limited on time and you have to be constantly worried about one-hit deaths, either from the environment or the various dinosaurs in your path. I simply can't fathom how any of the people who tested this game thought, yeah, this is a fun experience, let's ship it. Just for reference, I mentioned Sewer Shark earlier, which operates somewhat similarly, but there's one major difference. It tells you specifically where to go. During one of my play sessions, I spent 13 real-time minutes playing the second level, because I apparently wasn't making the correct turns, which led me to navigating the same sequences again and again and again. I don't think I would mind the maze mechanics of the game as much if it wasn't for the many times during each level where there's a potential to lose your life due to a one-hit kill. Successfully navigate a section where you have to avoid 5 Apatosauruses in a row? Well, that's nice, but you made a wrong turn, so now you have to do it again, and if you're unsuccessful this time, well, not only do you have to lose all your time off the clock that you managed to spend on the previous life, you now have to go back to the last checkpoint you got to, which means having to navigate that murderer's row at least one more time. And that's another thing, since there's no clearly defined path through the jungle, the levels all look more or less the same, and with just endless jungle on top of jungle, you never have a good idea of just how far you've made it in a level, or how much further you have to go, or even where the next checkpoint is to make it to. At least in the interminable snowboarding sections in Cliffhanger, you could tell where a checkpoint would save your progress in the level, and the patterns of obstacles in the level would clearly change enough for you to gauge relatively where you were. And when I'm saying the worst part of Cliffhanger is designed better than this game, you know there's some fairly serious design problems afoot. One last design gripe before I move on to the aspects of the game to complain about: the last 3 levels of the game. During levels 7 through 9, the game becomes even more of a rail shooter, by literally putting you in a motorized rail car and switching to a first-person view. These levels actually have an indicator of which turns to make in the way of a Geiger counter, which is good. But of course, they still had to find a way to mess things up, and that's by the mechanic involved in the last level, where you have to periodically switch to a rear view to slow down a T-Rex that's chasing at you, before switching back to the front view to continue progress through the level, and rinse and repeat until you either run out of time or win the game. This may not sound like a big deal, but my problem is, this isn't indicated anywhere. The closest this is to being mentioned is in the controller section of the manual, where there's a note about the B button being used to reverse your view, but nothing about why you would want to do that. The graphics in the Second Cataclysm are a mixed bag. On the one hand, as I mentioned earlier, the video sequences and comic book related art are all great and stand with the best that the console has to offer. Sure, they're a bit grainy, but everything on the Sega CD is, and it's clear that the source material is well represented. Unfortunately, you don't play the cutscenes, and the FMV sequences used in gameplay are much rougher. A huge aspect of the game is to not kill the dinosaurs and other creatures, because if you do, the hour timer will begin to run faster. However, in those first 6 levels specifically, when you're driving through the jungle, it's very difficult to determine just what things are ahead of you until you get close enough to where it would be too late to fire on them anyway. The video sequences in the underground section at the end hold up a bit better, I'm assuming because of that first-person focus versus third-person, but even then, things move so quickly, you still have a problem of being it hard to determine what you should shoot versus what you shouldn't in a timely manner. As bad as the gameplay graphics in the game are, the sound is much worse. Any sequence with speech and music together is mixed horribly, with the music being far too loud, making it difficult to make out what's being said. However, poor mixing in those sequences is a minor problem compared to the game's background music. Now, keep in mind, this is a Sega CD game, with the benefit of being able to use native CD audio during gameplay, and as a result, most Sega CD games have comparatively great music for the era due to this. Instead, the Second Cataclysm has possibly the worst background music of any game that I've reviewed in 145 episodes doing this channel. It's discordant, and it appears to be lacking any semblance of rhythm whatsoever. The best way I can describe the soundtrack to the Second Cataclysm is that it appears that they got the same synthesizer that was used to create the Secret of Monkey Island soundtrack, but rather than give it to a trained musician, they got a meth addict who was on a 3-day paint fume binge to bang away on the keys randomly. The game gets 100% better when you turn the background music off, which is something I never expected to say about a CD-based title. Cadillacs and Dinosaurs: The Second Cataclysm is one of these games where I knew early on, okay, this game is bad, but just how bad is it? And during some of those interminable passes at the first few levels, I was ready to award the game a bomb rating and just walk away. But then I thought about it some more, and after actually completing a few of the levels and skipping ahead to view some of the later game, I decided that while it's an awful game with some major issues, it's at least functional, and I do have to try to remember the limitations of the console and of being 1993. As a result, I'm begrudgingly handing out 1 star, but only because you can turn off the music, and the game allows for infinite continues at the last level you reached. Don't waste your time with this, and if you have to play some Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, seek out the Capcom beat 'em up instead. Okay, that was Cadillacs and Dinosaurs: The Second Cataclysm. And honestly, I haven't been this disappointed with a game on the channel in a long time. I mean, I'm talking Duke Nukem 3D level of disappointment here. This game is about as close to a total bomb as I think you can get while still eking out 1 star, and about the best thing I can say about the experience is that it's over. And it makes me appreciate something like Super Shark that much more. Next week on Zilog and Moto, I'm picking something that I know I'm going to enjoy a lot more, and as a bonus, it's a game that was never released in the United States, so the whole hidden gem possibility is totally in play. It's a racing game, and unlike this week's dumpster fire of a game, I'll have full control over my car, and thankfully, I'll actually know where I'm going. What an original idea, a racing game with a defined course. Please remember to subscribe if you like this video. And remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.